Good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce our second lecturer, Dr. Jacopo Castaldi. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Work, Education, and Teacher Education at Canterbury Christchurch University, United Kingdom. His main research interests are critical discourse studies, multimodality, mass-mediated communication, and the semiotic and cognitive aspects of manipulation. The focus on the interactive experiences of audiences and on meaning interpretation. He is a member of the executive committee of the International Network, or CADAAD, or Critical Approaches to Discourse Synapses Across Disciplines. He is on the advisory board of the 12th International Conference on Multimodality. His work has been published in international journals, and his first monograph, Multimodality, Ideology, and Manipulation, was published Routledge Studies in Multimodality series in April 2025. Moreover, he has guest edited a special issue on multimodality and reception studies, which was published in August 2025 in the journal Visual Communication. His current project is on the representation of Ukrainian displaced people on British television, and he is guest editing with Dr. Iwa Konieczna, a special issue on approaching manipulation and persuasion in current discourses for the journal Pragmatics and Society. Once again, let's welcome our second lecturer, Dr. Jacopo Castaldi.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Carl. Can people hear me?
Yes, sir. We hear you loud.
Perfect. Okay, and I'll just try and share my screen if that works. Just 1 second. One second, I'm just sharing the screen. Can you see the screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir. The screen is
okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank Carl for the great introduction and Professor Ingilan for the invitation. My talk is going to be about linguistics, media discourse, and multimodality. And just to give a brief overview of the outline, I will introduce basic concepts in multimodality and social semiotics. Then we'll have a look at multimodality and media discourse more specifically. And I thought a good way of actually understanding what we're talking about is actually looking at some analysis. So we'll have a look at a small example from a project I'm currently working on before reaching some conclusions. So, multimodality. First of all, and I'm sure that most of you in the audience would be aware of this, but I think it's always worth sort of reminding people. First of all, when we talk about multimodality, we have to differentiate between two concepts that are often kind of fused together, but should be separate. And these are mode and medium. So multimodal and multimedia are two separate constructs. Now, generally speaking, a mode is a codified system for making and interpreting meaning in a specific context of use. So people would sometimes list, so to speak, different modes, and they would list things like spoken language, written language, visuals of different kinds, maps, charts, graphs, and so on, other kind of images, sound, music, colors, and so on. But the definition of mode is still hotly debated. So the idea is that the same mode can be deployed through different media. For example, spoken language as a mode can happen both in face-to-face communication and on the radio or on a recording on YouTube and so on and so forth. And at the same time, two or more modes can be deployed through the same media. So if we think about a video recording, we will find in there spoken language, written and possibly written language. We can find music, sound, moving images, and other visuals of different kinds. So multimodal research in the very basics is research that concerns itself with more than one mode of communication at the same time. And although there are several approaches to multimodal research, the primary shared assumption behind all of them is that communication, whether mediated or face-to-face, is largely achieved through the simultaneous use of different modes. Even right now in this very lecture, I'm using spoken language, I'm using my gestures, my facial expressions, and also we have the slides with written language, images, logos, and so on and so forth. So we can see how multimodality is all around us. Now, social semiotics is a specific approach to multimodality. In fact, it's one of the first ones, at least in the kind of Anglo-Saxon tradition, to approach the idea of multimodality. And Kress and Van Leeuwen were the people that kind of started to talk about this particular way of looking at communication. And what they did, they simply expanded the sociological study of language, so from Michael Halliday, systemic function and linguistics, to the sociological study of semiotic resources at large, where language is nothing but one of the available options. So effectively, although they all came from a linguistics background, like we do, they expanded, so to speak, the area of research to other ways of making meaning and communicating. And therefore, they were interested in three aspects: cataloging semiotic resources, their history and their meaning potentials, investigating how resources are used in specific contexts, and contributing to the development of new resources or to novel uses of existing ones. And for my personal interest and perspective, I would also add a further focus, which is investigating how semiotic modes and semiotic resources are interpreted in specific contexts. One final very important point to highlight is that, similar to language, all signs and their materiality, so all modes, are neither global nor ahistorical. So they vary through space, so geographical areas, through cultural areas, and they also vary through time. You know, a sign may mean something now, and it might have meant something different 30 years ago, and may mean something different in 30 years' time. So just to get a brief idea of what a mode could look like, and again, this is a very debated area, but you can see here a scheme of a theoretical mode, a model of a mode. So the yellow circle, the smaller one, so to speak, that you can see, is the material substrate. So each systems of sign would have some kind of materiality. So if we think about spoken language, the wavelength, if you like, the air and the sounds that make up phonemes and then words and so on and so forth would be the material substrate. And within this, the blue circles are the axis of organization of this material. And you can have a paradigmatic axis, which is individual items within the system, say individual words within spoken language, and syntagmatic axis of organization, some kind of syntax. So the way these different units are then put together to make coherent meanings. The middle circle, the semiotic resources, is what I've described as abstract potential metafunctional constructs. And this again comes from Halliday's systemic functional linguistics, and we'll have a look in more detail at what I believe this could be categorized as. And finally, you have the discourse semantics, which is where the abstract, so to speak, mode becomes actually meaningful. So spoken word in this specific context of a lecture becomes meaningful. So you can understand and interpret what I'm saying, because we all understand that this is a lecture and we expect certain purposes, functions, and conventions from it. And semiotic resources is or can be divided in 4 different areas. We can have discursive resources, pragmatic ones, stylistic, and textual. And different modes can contribute different resources to the overall composition. So, for example, the slides could, in this particular case, the slides can give the textual organization to the lecture. So they one of the things that they do, they function to logically organize the discourse. Right, so let's move on to some more practical areas. So let's have a look at multimodality and media discourse. Now, carrying out a multimodal text analysis wouldn't be much different from analyzing any kind of text, even if we were doing only a linguistic analysis. I guess the main difference here is that, as well as looking at language, we look at other modes. So we could start at the top by identifying the main characteristics of the text. Who are the producers? What is the genre, the purpose, the target audience, and the medium of delivery? Then we would identify the semiotic modes that are utilized in that particular text. And I'm using text in a very broad sense. So there could be language, there could be paralanguage and nonverbal communication, there could be visuals of some kind, still images, moving images, color, and so on. There could be some sonic modes like sound and music, and also other kind of materialities depending on the text. Then the third step would be to analyze the semiotic modes and semiotic resources individually, relationally, so in conjunction, so to speak, and also holistically as a whole. Then the fourth step could focus on specific aspects of communication. We could look at social actors following Van Leeuwen. We could look at discourses following, for example, Fairclough. We could look at themes, tropes, metaphors, narratives, purposes, and so on and so forth. So at that point, we would kind of focus on one specific aspect of communication. And then we could also kind of bring the text within its social context and then analyze the connection between the text, discourse, and society. And again, we could look at intertextuality, interdiscursivity, if we're following, again, Fairclough and that kind of critical approach to discourse. We could look at ideology or connections to world events. So let's have a look at an example. Well, first of all, and I apologize for the kind of self-promotion, but the book that Carl kindly mentioned in the introduction is a good example of this particular approach at work. So the focus here was to corroborating multimodal critical discourse analysis with reception studies, so to analyzing how somebody watching documentaries in this particular case engaged with them and negotiated their meaning. And there was a double interest. There was an interest in the multimodal representation of ideologies in the travel documentaries themselves. And then there was an interest in the cognitive mechanisms that are at play in ideology building and manipulative processes through media interactions, which was done by looking at the interactions, the negotiation of meaning between an audience and these travel documentaries. But let's have a look at a more concrete example so that we understand a bit better what we're talking about. So let's say that for this particular purpose, we have these 3 research questions. So I'm interested at the moment in looking at how the Ukrainian displaced people following the war between Russia and Ukraine are represented on British television. So the first research question would be, how are the Ukrainians represented in the multimodal text that we're going to be looking at? The second question could be, how is Russia represented? And the third question, which would be kind of bringing together what we've talked so far is what are the semiotic modes and semiotic resources contributions to these representations. So the text that we're going to be focusing on is the introduction. It's about 1 minute to a television program that was aired on the BBC on the 13th of March 2022. So not even about 2 weeks after Russia invaded the Ukraine. We're going to be watching the introduction, and then we're going to be looking at how we could approach its analysis. And please let me know if the video doesn't work.
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more than 2 million refugees have fled the country. It's the largest movement of people in Europe since the Second World War.
Can you believe this? Can you?
Hundreds of thousands of them have flowed through Lviv station. The story of this station is the story of Ukraine's people and the war that's consuming them.
Okay, I hope that you could see and hear the clip. So now the first step with any other kind of text, whether we're doing conversation analysis, or whether we're doing textual analysis, meaning looking at written language, the first thing to do would be to provide some kind of transcription of that text, right? So here is a screenshot from my transcription of that particular scene. So the first minute and 20 seconds of that program. And as you can see, the social actors, I'm following Van Leeuwen here, 1996, the social actors will be Ukraine, A1, the refugees, A2, Russia, A3, and Ukrainians as a whole, A4. And then you can see that you have the first three column there, sorry, the column 3 to 5 that provide the linguistic analysis, the next two that provide the audio analysis, and the next three that provide the visual analysis. So we're looking at the language, looking at the music and sound, and looking at the shots, the actual moving images. And in yellow, red, and green is my interpretation of whether that particular social actor has been depicted in a positive green, neutral yellow, or negative red fashion. So we can see here, for example, that the Ukraine, the refugees, and also Russia in the linguistic analysis is pretty much described with neutral terms. Whereas in terms of processes, we can see that there are some positive processes to describe Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And Russia, on the other hand, is described in an agentive negative process. And visually, as we'll see, we can see the Ukrainians, but we can't see Russia. We'll have a look at that in a second. So that would be the first step of our analysis. And now this analysis can be done manually, as I did it here, or it can be done through some multimodal annotation software, such as Elan, for example. Now, then more specifically, we could kind of look at mapping out, so to speak, the different contributions of semiotic modes and semiotic resources. So if we stick with the social actor of the Ukrainian displaced people, the second column will give us all the different modes that we have identified in this program. So we have spoken language, we have written language, sound, music, and moving image. And then the other four columns will describe the four different semiotic resources that we saw in the figure earlier on. So, for example, if you look at the discursive resource, then the spoken language provides some denotation. There are words that provide some kind of, I guess, factual aspects, like millions of family, Ukrainian family, children, sometimes on their own. But we also have words that provide a connotative effect, some kind of emotional, if you like, connection with the viewer. So we have words like terrified, somewhere safe, safety, families ripped apart, and so on. The spoken language also provides a kind of narrative. So again, on the discursive level, that's the narrative which is established through dates, through references to specific points in time. So we have February 2022, we have now, we have one day, and also we have past and perfect tenses. And there are also elements of intertextuality and interdiscursivity, for example, with references to European war history. Now, if we go further down, then we can have a look also how the music, for example, contributes to the discursive connotation of again, feelings and emotions. We have like a medium tempo, minor key piece, which kind of gives this idea of tension, expectations, and clearly the moving images here provide a lot of information. And again, denotation would be shots of real life events on the platform, people on the platform waiting or trying to board the train, but also there are a lot of connotative elements. There's sadness, there are people crying, empathy, pride, support. And again, there could be some intertextual, interdiscursivity elements there. The idea of crisis, the discourse of resistance, and also perhaps the idea of Schindler's List, or simply the connection of trains in the Ukraine, with the connection of trains all around Europe during Nazi Germany that were transporting people to the concentration camps. Now, we could do the same also for the other areas. So pragmatics, we can imagine, we can expect that a factual type of television program will be describing, narrating, and reporting things. These are all kind of informative text types, and all of them seem to be there. So when we have a look at the narrative, there's description and there is kind of information going on. So the communicative acts that are performed by the spoken language are to inform predominantly, but also to persuade. And there are, for example, here it's very interesting to see who does the information, who does the persuading in terms of the modes. And if we look at the music column for the pragmatic, there is primarily an element of persuasion there. So to persuade the viewer that the situation being shown in the film is one to be empathetic with. Again, we could do the same with stylistic and with textual elements, but again, this kind of gives an idea of how the different modes and semiotic resources contribution can be analyzed for a specific social actor. If you look at Russia, on the other hand, the first thing that we note is that we didn't really see Russia on the screen, so to speak. It was present in the spoken language with connotations that were kind of violent. For example, we have words like attack, full-scale invasion, bringing war. And again, there are interdiscursivity elements of war, for example, that are connected to that particular social actor. And similarly, obviously, the music is kind of, again, it's the same music that we heard earlier, but obviously in the context of a victim and an aggressor, the sad music again persuade us to side with the victim against the aggressor, right? So that's like again a persuasive kind of strategy that the music mode allows the text producers to employ. So if you wanted to kind of summarize briefly the findings, I'm trying to bring this to a conclusion. So if we ask the first question was how are the Ukrainian displaced people represented? There's, generally speaking, a neutral or positive representation of the Ukrainian people who are shown as the victim, and rightly so. and rightly so. And empathy is created with the viewer. On the other hand, Russia is represented as a faceless threat. And when I say faceless, I literally mean that there was no visual, so to speak, representation of Russia as the aggressor, but the language, again, with attack, full invasion, and so on, full scale invasion, and so on, gave the idea of this threat. So, if we think about this text along the lines of like rhetoric analysis, where based on the Aristotelian differentiation of rhetorics in ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos looking at the credibility, so to speak, of the person informing us of something, pathos looking at the emotional connection, and logos looking at the argumentative solidity of the text. Then we can see how the modes and resources contribute to these three areas in different ways. So, for example, we see the host, the presenter of the program, walking along the Ukrainians in a very caring and benevolent way. So that kind of creates an image of the text producer or the person who's giving us the information as being somebody we can trust. Because they want the good for the people they're looking at. Pathos, the emotions that were primarily kind of addressed through music and moving image, although also some bits of language have there. And logos was especially addressed through the spoken language, with numbers given to make us realize the scale of the problem, and an invader victim or invader aggressor kind of narrative, which was built linguistically and again made us somehow side with one side or the others, in this case the Ukrainian. And just to be clear, the point I'm doing this research is to show how a good representation of refugees or people at war can be done. Because very often when we've had other kinds of refugees in this country, in the UK, from Syria and from Afghanistan, very often the media representation was very negative. Whereas in this case, it's very positive. And obviously there are many kind of, geopolitical reasons for it. But my point is that from a semiotic point of view, this is actually a very good example of how refugees and people in need should be represented. That's why I'm focusing on it. So to conclude, we're kind of trying to discuss here how applied linguistics can also be not just about language, so about moving from linguistics to multimodality. And this is based on the idea that virtually all communication, regardless of the medium, is multimodal. So if we only focus on the language, on linguistic analysis, then we end up having incomplete accounts of the context, the mechanisms, the purposes, and the effects of communicative exchanges and events, which is why a multimodal approach is very often necessary, because it allows us to have a better understanding of what is going on. And finally, so a social semiotic approach to multimodality provides, I believe, stronger theoretical and methodological foundations to investigate communicative exchanges and events, regardless of the medium that it is they are delivered through. And on that, I end. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much as well, Dr. Castaldi, for that very enlightening presentation. Your discussion has given us a deeper understanding of how language, media, and multimodality interact to shape meaning in our world. And on that, to further deepen our discussion, once again, we now open the floor for your questions and insight, now led by Sebastian Rhodes C. Maginay, Language Student Society External Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Now, with all of the knowledge and wisdom that we have gained after listening to our second lecture, I'm sure your mind is currently full of thoughts and questions. So, if you're open to share your takeaways about the lecture or you want to raise a question, feel free to raise your hand so you will be entertained. And if you have trouble accessing your microphone, you may also type in the chat box your comments or questions. So now I'll be calling someone raising their hand. Okay, so there's no one going to raise a question to our second lecturer. Okay, there's someone. Okay, please correct me if I'm wrong if I mispronounce your name. May I call on Kyle? Kyle, Miss Hannah Kylenia. Miss Hannah Kylenia, please open your microphone.
Yes, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Um, Hello, Dr. Castaldi. Thank you for delivering such an insightful lecture. So you mentioned that in social semiotics, meaning depends on context. So in a culturally diverse country like ours, how can researchers properly account for cultural differences when interpreting multimodal messages so that the analysis remains fair and accurate across different audiences?
Very good.
That's my
That's an excellent question, Hannah. I think the main idea is to try and understand how science evolved in a specific culture or in a specific community of practice. So it's important to understand that, for example, what my analysis was based on was a British or European Western understanding of certain ways of communicating. So, for example, if you think about music, right, there is this idea that the key of a musical piece, whether, for example, if it's in a minor key or in a major key, would have a certain emotional associations to go with it. Now, for example, minor keys would have associations of sadness, of nostalgia, and so on and so forth. But that is, for example, something which is embedded within the cultural makeup of Western European kind of cultures. It could be different elsewhere. So it's certainly very important to not to simply understand the mechanics of the different modes, so what they're actually doing, but how they may have a specific significance, a specific importance within the context. So take, for example, religion. Now, if we think about a country which is predominantly Muslim and a country which is predominantly Catholic or Christian, there could be very different mental associations that are made between members of that society to a symbol. Let's say, for example, the symbol of the cross. Okay. So if I am looking at a specific text, one thing to bear in mind is who produced that text, and most importantly, who is the text intended for. So in my case, it was a British television program, so we can expect that the audience would be British people. And we can make a set of assumptions also based on our knowledge of the socioeconomic makeup of British society on how people would be interpreting certain signs. So I would say that's probably the best way to approach it, is to consider who produced whatever you're looking at and who was it for, and what kind of cultural assumptions and expectations can be made between the producer and the receiver of that text.
Thank you so much, sir.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for your participation, Miss Hannah Kyle. Now I'll be calling on another participant. Okay, someone raised their hand. Miss Joyce? Miss Erica Joyce Seprado. Please unmute your microphone, please.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good day, Dr. Castaldi. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation on multimodal representations. Just a quick question. Since you mentioned that eros, pathos, and logos were all evident across different modes, may I ask which of these rhetorical appeals do you think had the strongest impact on shaping the viewer's perception of the conflict?
Okay, so now we're moving, and this is my other big area of interest, into the interpretation of a text. Now, one thing that reception studies in multimodal discourse have shown is that we cannot expect to have the same interpretation from different people. So, first of all, I don't think there's so okay. Let's say that some people may be more persuaded by the emotive aspects of the representation, and that could be because those kind of people are themselves more sensor type of people, so they're more susceptible, so to speak, to emotions. They're more emotive people themselves. There may be other people that are not really too emotive or emotional and may be only persuaded through reasoning and through providing arguments. So I don't think that any of those three areas are predominant. I think they're all there because there is an understanding that different people would be swayed and persuaded in different ways. So I think they all need to be there. I think the one thing that is key, though, is the ethos dimension. Because regardless of whether you will engage more with the emotive aspect of the argument or with the logical aspects of the argument, what you all want to know is that you can trust the person that is giving you the information. So I think that actually out of those three, the key one to establish from the part of the text producer is a credible source, a credible informant, so to speak. So that then if we trust the person and believe that the person wants to genuinely give us truthful information about what they're seeing, then whether or not we are swayed by the emotive or the argumentative aspects of that information doesn't really matter anymore. So yeah, that was a good question, actually, one that I never really considered, but that would be my answer. If you look at some in pragmatics and in cognitive pragmatics, there's a communication theory called relevance theory, and the proponents also talk about the idea of epistemic vigilance, which would be our critical filters when we receive information. And they talk exactly about that. They talk about two levels of epistemic vigilance: vigilance towards the source, so towards the informant, and vigilance towards the content. Now, what they say is that if we do not trust the source, we will not be persuaded by the content. So I think that in that case, if we move down to the Aristotelian triad, then the ethos is the one that needs to be established first and foremost. So people need to be able to trust the person giving them information. And then it doesn't matter if it's persuaded on an emotive or argumentative level. But that was an excellent question, Erica.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castaldi. I'm looking forward to read more of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Miss Erica. And thank you, Mr. Castaldi, for answering Miss Erica's question. Now we'll be moving on. I believe we can cater another question. Let me call on Bailal Trilas Cunha. Mr. Bailal Trilas Cunha, you may open your microphone.
Hello, am I audible? Am I heard?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
perfectly.
thank you. So, before I state my question, I would like to thank you, Mr. Castaldi, for giving us a comprehensive discussion about your topic. Now, I've understood from your discussion, like how these linguistic choices, visual rhetorics, and multimodal designs contribute to information ethics. What I'm just curious, like, where do we draw the line in doing these practices, or do we draw the line to tailoring the content for specific audiences and crossing the line into bias or propaganda? Because like, what criteria and analytical methods can we use to identify and critique such boundaries across different cultural contexts?
Again, very good question. So I guess part of the answer to that question goes back to my answer to the first question. So obviously, there is an element of carefully considering the context in which a specific text is produced, distributed, and consumed. Now, one thing, if you look at the book that I mentioned, one thing that you see is that when analyzing a context, when analyzing a specific text, there is a lot of extra work that needs to go around, for example, similar representations of the same topic in different contexts. For example, one of the documentaries in the book is about, I'm talking about a region which is fairly close to where you are, Burma, Myanmar. So one of the programs is about Burma. And there is, for example, a short description in there of the time where Burma was part of the British Empire in this documentary that I watched. And the description that is given is almost as if the British Empire was a good colonizer, so to speak. Now, what I had to do was to go and look at history books. I had to actually move into history and look at other accounts of the British Empire times in Myanmar to find out contrasting views. Now, you can't just say, for example, that somebody is trying to be manipulative or something is just propaganda, because it's difficult to judge the intention of a text producer. But what you can say is that although the text producer is providing this particular representation of the phenomenon, there is a totally different one which is also provided elsewhere, which this particular text doesn't take into account. Then I think it's up to the reader of your work to kind of make their own mind up whether or not to think, okay, so they maybe purposely left out information because they knew it would go against their narrative, or maybe they just made a mistake and didn't do it. So that would be more a matter of, as you say, subjective interpretation of something. But what we can do is being rigorous, both in the analysis of the text itself and into trying to understand what kind of representation is provided, and on the interdisciplinary, if you like, research around the specific topic, so that you can show not only what you find out in the specific text, but also what other available discourses and texts are around that same topic and what they say. So I think it's a matter of being rigorous. Then whether or not people believe you, or whether or not what you say is believable, it's a matter, for the person reading you or listening to you to make a judgment on.